All right, Luddic Path. Welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I've been watching a lot of your other episodes, and it's a pretty cool show. I'm quite impressed that you're able to get as many sort of, I guess, high names or big names inside of the DR as you have.
Well, thank you, man. I really enjoy it. And just to clarify, Luddic, your own show you and Walrus do together, Walrus, who I had on last week, is really great. I enjoy it a lot. I actually reached out to you, on one of those episodes. And before we get into that and kind of why I brought you on, do you think you could just introduce like yourself and then how you ended up here?
Yes, so I go by the handle Luddic Path on YouTube, which is a name that's actually from the video game Star Sector. That's like the sort of open world single player space exploration game. That, to be honest, I didn't even play that much of, but it's put up in such a way that you have like you have 7 different factions that fight over power in sort of a future sci-fi space. And one of these factions is basically this kind of like the new Luddite, hardcore fundamentalist anti-technology suicide bomber faction that's named the Luddic Path, and that's where I have the logo from. And I mean, at the time, I was dabbling in a lot of like Ted Kaczynski, a lot of sort of Luddite stuff, and I thought it was just really cool. And besides, I like the kind of aesthetic of the like this kind of underground freedom fighter, anti-tech. It is quite metal, although it could be considered larpy for someone like me to use that aesthetic, because I am basically in real life kind of a middle class person. But I mean, most people on YouTube probably know me from the Luddic Path channel. That is basically just kind of like this right wing meme channel that I just use for shit posting. But the reason I am on this show is because I'm just like a regular panelist and co-host on the Longhouse. That's like the Scandinavian Dissident right show. I think probably the only one that is of the type of format that it has. So, I mean, in terms of like my origin story, how I ended up in this place, because it is quite a peculiar corner of the internet, as you said. I mean, I remember like being a teenager, I was introduced to a lot of these image board sites. I mean, I'm sort of middle of the road millennial, so I'm in my early 30s currently, and like this was like way back when like early 4chan, that kind of stuff, and through that I got exposed to a lot of the stuff that would be sort of the planting seeds from what turned out to be like the online right that exists now. I follow another YouTuber that's called Ubersoy, and I was reading his telegrams because he puts out a lot of studies on various things, various topics relating to what we're doing, and he posted a study where it suggested that being right wing is actually correlated with being on the internet for a long time, or spending a lot of time on the internet, especially on these platforms that have at least nominally freedom of speech or freedom of expression. And I thought that at somehow this must have seeped into me, even though I was looking at these image boards and I was seeing all this kind of radical stuff, but I didn't know what to make of it at the time when I was maybe like 14 or 15, because this just seems like it's so far away from actual, politics in the early 2000s. And, like politics in the early 2000s very much seem to go in the opposite direction of this stuff. Like, yeah, you had the Obama years and the sort of pre-Obama years that seem to be like really, to me, a kind of sort of cultural grooming period to make white people warm up to black people more. I don't know if you can relate. You're probably a bit younger than me.
So yeah, I'm essentially, if I had to guess, I'm probably 5 years younger than you. So I was born in '99. I'm an old Zoomer, and so to me, I also kind of involved on the internet. I kind of had 2 paths into it, as I discussed earlier. Before we went live, I was, to a large extent raised by my paternal grandparents, who are the nicest people in the world. I love them. We have a great relationship, but they are kind of the most stereotypical, evangelical boomer cons in the world. So I was raised to a certain degree in a conservative community, but this was kind of during the Bush and Obama years, and it was very much like obvious to me as a child that this wasn't, because as crude it is to say, it wasn't a winning strategy, right? Like, it was very obvious that, even to myself as a young child, right, that like John McCain wasn't going to ride in on a white horse and save us. It rang hollow. And so I kind of also found myself on on the internet, even if it was kind of like one generation back. So I got onto 4chan, same thing. And I also kind of got into very early YouTube, when it was still very much kind of like the Wild West, when you could see like, cartel videos and instructions on how to make crack. And so like there's that same kind of like
German historical revisionism.
yeah, exactly,
if you just typed in some like the history of certain events that happened in the 1940s, then you would just get like full on revisionist documentaries and so on. I mean, I remember it was quite wild. I mean, a lot of the stuff that's on BitChute now, you could just get on YouTube, probably on like the starting page, just in recommendations.
Well, right, exactly. And so, like, even if that didn't, to me at least, prime me to be what we would consider dissident, right? It did kind of prime me not to trust the people in charge, even if not directly, And obviously, like, to me, it took a long time of kind of like slowly, like, realizing, like, wait a minute, the description on the box isn't actually what's inside it. It's not, oh, we'll vote them out next time. That kind of like basic, high school civics class version of things. That took a little bit longer. But it's interesting because I do very much think that that's true, that kind of like spending time on the internet and spending time on kind of like the non-commercialized side of the internet. So for instance, places like these kind of like odd free speech platforms, which aren't particularly lucrative. And so the only reason you go there is kind of like if you have a weird mix of like passion and like, I guess, like, I don't know, some kind of like social disorder. But dude, I would agree with you there.
Yeah, no, I certainly think it's very hard to go on these platforms and be exposed to a lot of the behind the scenes stuff and compare notes with people and then walk away and not think anything of it. I mean, this is something you have to actively suppress in your mind when you walk around, in the world. I mean, if you have been exposed to some of the theory and some of the literature and some of the revisionism, then you basically, it's like the difference between watching let's say like a romantic comedy as a child and as an adult. When you're an adult, you can see the references and a lot of these sexual innuendos and stuff that the kid can't see. But that's kind of how I look at the normies. It's like they're watching they're watching the same movie as me, but they don't get the kind of jokes or the pointers to a lot of the more indecent stuff that that I'm seeing. But of course, it's harder now, I think, to sort of ignore these things. I mean, I'm getting more and more suspicious of the people who remain in the sort of normie camp, because I don't know how they do it. Where do they find the space to exist where where the neutrality is even allowed at this point?
I very much agree with you. And I think the other thing that's kind of valuable is that it kind of provides you the assurance that you're not the only person noticing it. Because I think there's a really like normal, rational social inclination, and it's kind of made fun of in like those clips from the 60s, of, one normal person and six plants, walk into an elevator with a hidden camera, and if 6 out of 7 people all face one direction, well, the last person kind of falls in, like, because most of the time that's a pretty useful social behavior. But it is kind of difficult unless you're extraordinarily disagreeable, which I also think is highly correlated with being right wing, is that you do kind of look around and you're like, well, okay, if no one else has a problem, I guess there's not a real problem. I guess I'm the outlier here. And so going online, to these kind of like corners that we ended up in and seeing like, wait a minute, I'm not the only one who notices that, like, wait a minute, there are how many people coming across the border, there are, wait a minute. They're doing what in schools? Like, I have to sign the piece of paper that says what, and if everyone else is kind of looking around and like, oh, well, like it's, especially as a young person, it's very easy to kind of look at that as kind of like the baseline, kind of like the null, like the null state. And so like being online and having other people, maybe not in the most, as as I'm sure you'll remember, like the pre 2016 4chan days, like maybe not in the most intelligent, well thought out way, but at least you kind of got the point that, wait a minute, like there is something wrong here. I'm not the only one.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, especially with everything that's around us now. Sorry. First of all, like your first point about the agreeability thing or agreeableness, because I have tested myself on the kind of the oceans test, and I do score like very low on agreeableness. I do think that's just sort of persistent feature among people in these spheres, which is good because then we can sort of try to look at reality a bit more objectively. But it's also bad from a sort of cooperation perspective, right?
Yeah,
That's one of the
exactly.
other sort
Herding
of
cats.
so, the herding cats problem, or like, it is one of these things that I really do think a lot about. How exactly can you organize the right wing effectively? But back to the point again about the noticing that stuff is a little bit weird. Or I mean, recently when I went on Google, like you have Google on your browser on your phone, and then Google will just recommend you articles, right? And I mean, Google knows everything about you basically, and they can give you everything that you're interested in. Fundamentally, it's not a problem for them at all. But the stuff that I'm getting there, it's like what's that guy Moshe Hamid, the book like The Last White Man, and that that is what they're serving me as like the top. Oh yeah, this is the top thing you should be interested in. A book basically about like white people going away forever. Like that's I don't know how like the normies deal with that stuff. This has to be a sort of almost kind of Lovecraftian phenomenon where they can't even process that this stuff is happening, that they're being served up like this kind of content. Or they will, if they are interested, they have to go down this kind of like hyper rationalization route where they'll read some mainstream journalists explaining that no, it's not about white people, it's really it's whiteness, and that's different. It's not the same as it's not the same as white people. I mean, basically meaning that okay, it's okay for you to exist as a white person, you just can't ever like organize yourself on behalf of your interests, like ever. That just can't happen.
Well, I think one of the other things, and so my mental kind of like divide for Zoomer millennial, and this is not particularly official, but it's basically, can you remember 9/11? That seems like a decent enough, divide between, old or young millennials and old Zoomers. And so I can't, right? I was alive before it, but I was in diapers, right?
As you
And
were
so to
two
me,
years but then there's actually 10 years between us when you said how old we were, but yeah, go on.
okay, that makes more sense because I must have picked that up during one of your episodes because Walrus was very upset at me for thinking that he was older or significantly older than he was, but that makes sense. Okay, I understand. That must have been you. Anyway, and so I never went through kind of that shift in culture, kind of post 9/11. I understand it as much as I can, right? Because many of my friends do remember it. My political influences, my mentors, they remember it, and they remember the shift. But going through COVID was actually kind of helpful in a way because it, on one hand, it helped me understand, what a shift like that was like, and it also fully convinced me of the fact that the vast majority of people just genuinely don't think about things, and they shouldn't have to. I think it's pretty easy to kind of move the goalposts, being surrounded by kind of like above average people who are kind of hyper interested in something, and then you see something that you're like, well, why everyone should care about this? Everyone should notice this doesn't add up. And for Susan and or Apple Podcast, who is, approving my show, I believe everything. I believe all the science, whatever the science is, I believe it. But, you kind of look and you're like, well, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. And if you're thinking like, well, how come these people don't notice? Well, I'll just show them more graphs. I'll show them more figures, Tom Woods style. You're going to go insane. You're going to rip your hair out. You're going to shoot yourself. You're going to walk out into traffic. But kind of realizing that, like, wait a minute, like people don't think. People just kind of operate on autopilot, and kind of, especially the more high agreeability types, will just go along to get along almost no matter what. Do you see what I'm
Yeah,
getting at?
I have a similar thought as well, and I totally get where you're coming from, but I have a slightly different perspective on it. Especially, this is something that happens when I'm talking to colleagues and people like that. And the problem isn't just the fact that they're running on autopilot. I think they have a lot of thoughts, but the idea that, say, like you would convert someone like that to our way of thinking. I mean, the question is, what would they do then? I think they would feel completely powerless in that situation, that they sort of, okay, how are we supposed to resist this stuff? What am I supposed to do now? Because like if they stick with the mainstream narrative, it's very clear, like the path you're expected to take, well, how you're expected to think. You know, you can get with the program, as they say. It's sort of easy solution. But when you start getting out on in our territories, it's kind of the Wild West in terms of how you should approach life. I mean, you have to just start over with everything, and like every single institution you're taking part of, you have to reconsider. You know, how you know, what should I think about food? You know, what should I think about certain medicines and so on, and what should I think about government institutions and education and science, and everything has to be put on the table and reevaluated. And I think it's just like too much. They just don't see the almost like from a rational calculation perspective. I don't think they see the value in trying to take that route. You know, I think it's too strenuous for them. I don't know what you think about that.
I completely agree with you, and I think that this is kind of I guess like a pre-modern way of kind of viewing society, right? When the idea, and this is both a Christian idea and kind of like a broader Western one, that kind of the body politic is quite literally a body, you know, so people kind of serve different uses within one kind of, I guess, like conglomeration. And I think that it's pretty easy, and I see this in a lot of people, to kind of build up a disdain for normies, you know, for like the average Joe. But you do need those people to exist. You know, they serve a function in society. And I think it is kind of one of the failures of modernity that those type of people have to concern themselves at all with politics. You know, like to me, at least, when I think of like, well, okay, what's the desired end in all of this? It's pretty much, it's the idea that the political kind of goes back to kind of like the least area it can possibly cover. You know, so instead of everything being political, almost nothing is, because essentially what you or I or kind of like average Joe Blow on the street really doesn't matter.
Yeah, I
You know?
totally agree with you on that, actually. I mean, if the politicians, if the elites were doing their job properly, I would not be here talking to you, right? I would not be thinking about this at all. I would just be going to my job and grilling and just trying to, you know, showing up for events and so on, celebrating voting in elections. As you know, that's if they actually did their job properly. But because they're making so many mistakes, you end up creating enemies. I mean, you end up just unnecessarily agitating a lot of people that you shouldn't have, who probably just like to live their life and, you know, play their video games. They'd like to do art. They'd like to participate in things, but because they have to use a lot of power. You know, if you have to weaponize all of these institutions in favor of their own political ideas, there is something wrong there. There's something, you know, I think fundamentally unnatural about a lot of these ideological ideas that the elite hold currently. You know, I mean, it's easy for us to sort of think that the progressive, like this sort of progressive group, the progressive alliance, like the victory is just natural for them, and that history just flows in one direction. It's just going to get more and more progressive. But I don't know if you've seen the episodes on Longhouse that I did on the Open Society Foundation.
I have, yeah.
But I mean, looking up, you know, stuff like researching the Open Society and Soros and his foundation and all the work he does, I really got the exact opposite impression. I mean, like it's actually the progressives that are swimming upstream in a sense, even though it seems to us like it's completely different, because they're very well funded and they're very well organized and they have a lot of motivated people. But what they're doing is like fundamentally unnatural, and I mean, you can see it in you know, with the Open Society operating in a lot of these Baltic countries, like, you know, the previous Yugoslavia, Serbia, Moldova, Ukraine, and so on, that it's like a very much an uphill battle to introduce a lot of these, what we call like these sort of past values into these societies. They have to just constantly put money in and just have, you know, complete vigilance in maintaining what they call the Open Society at all times. And it was actually a little bit white pilling for me to see that, because it means that you just need to try to correct course a little bit here. It's not like we have to, like, it's insurmountable.
Well, I completely agree with you, and it's part of the reason that I end every single episode by just kind of reminding the viewers that, look, like the lie can't last forever. And look, that doesn't mean that they can't cause an extraordinary amount of damage in the meantime, right? So like the example I kind of like to use as a mental one is Lysenko. Lysenko couldn't change the rules of biology. He created a giant famine. The crops didn't grow how he wanted them to grow. He couldn't distort reality, but he could kill quite a lot of people attempting to distort reality. And so to me, and I use this analogy not to become kind of like a Bible beater, but just because it's one that it kind of colors how I see the world, which is that if you kind of view like there being a God or there being a Tao or a telos or whatever, there's kind of like an objective, like overriding state of morality. Kind of like our job on the right is kind of conforming ourselves to a reality, and what we can see is kind of like a force that doesn't conform to reality yet. Fair enough, it has a whole lot of power, especially now. But by virtue of the fact that they don't conform to reality, they're constantly essentially burning their resources to try and kind of like patch up the cracks. It's this like continual battle to kind of force the boulder uphill, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. But this is something that in the last stream that I did about Yuval Noah Harari, the Israeli historian, he does talk a lot about the difference between like the intersubjective world and the sort of objective world, and this kind of relationship between the two, where you can get a lot of leverage out of this intersubjectivity, where you almost kind of shape the world around you by what everybody believes, and that in turn ends up almost shaping the objective world. Because everybody believes in something so much that in the end that ends up like changing. It becomes like the self-fulfilling prophecy where you say that basically there's no difference between men and women, and they keep repeating it, and the men are becoming more feminine and women are becoming more masculine, and it's like it ends up becoming reality at some point. So it is a little bit scary in that sense. You run up against certain hard limits of reality, but I guess that's what fascinates me with the communists, how driven they've been sort of as political operators, even though we can look back at the experiments and see how many failures they've had in terms of basically colliding with objective reality. But listening to the academic agent kind of introduce the ideas of elite theory is something that made it a lot easier for me to understand politics in general and why things end up the way they do. And in a sense, I do also think that the reasons that the Soviets were so successful is that they just did not care, about what the regular person in the street thought about their ideas, and they didn't even care like what the objective reality said about their ideas. They just had full faith in what they were doing, and they organized themselves, and they were able to kind of take power in that sense. They had a lot of other problems, but I think there's a lot to learn from them. Aside from you can look at all their failures, but they also did a lot of things that were quite on point in terms of understanding how the political machine operates.
No, that's well said. At the very least, like they certainly knew how to build a movement, and obviously like to incredibly destructive ends, but there's something to be learned there. Like I read at the start of the year, I spent a lot of time reading Lenin. I read State and Revolution, and it's interesting because obviously there's probably 30% of it that is kind of like odd communist ramblings, and it's especially odd with Lenin because about 70% of it is extremely astute political observation. And then there's that little bit of theory that almost seems to completely violate what he spends the rest of his time talking about, but he's become kind of like fixated on this, like almost like mental trap. And to me, it's interesting because I like what Thomas says about communism, that in many ways, communism kind of like it really was a force we've never seen before, something like it. Like he says, it was kind of the satanic, force of destruction, but there is kind of this like dark genius to it. It's almost this like perfectly evolved creature to a certain extent. Well, maybe for the time it was.
Yeah, and I think they really understood the elite theory angle, and we're circling back to what we talked about in the beginning with being just kind of blackpilled with normies, right? And thinking about like how many graphs they have to show you, how much they have to show you. Well, if you're sufficiently, read up on elite theory, you don't show them anything. You basically just tell them what they're going to think, and you don't spend any time like reading comment sections on newspapers and Facebook and so on, and just feeling frustrated about how dumb these people are, because eventually there's just going to be like a small minority of people who will organize and take power and will just set the agenda. I mean, it's tempting to look at politics as something that's bottom up, but I mean, in retrospect, the idea that you'd say like all of communist Russia, that they everybody was on board with the communist vision from the start, like this was some organic thing. I mean, it's absolutely not organic, and you see the same thing as well with a lot of the progressive stuff, like the LGBTQ, the trans stuff. It's like the trans movement in the LGBTQ lobby. They also don't really give a shit what the normie thinks. They're just going completely attacking the levers that they need to attack to move the discussion where they want it to be, and have just like complete disinterest in trying to convince anybody that are sort of standing on the fence or in the middle or getting consent from other people,
Right. So I'm a little curious, and this is to slightly change the subject. The thing that actually really like drew me into your channel is, or sorry, the Longhouse, right, which is the show you appear on, is your discussions about new atheists. And this is connected. I'll bridge the circle eventually. But if you could you kind of explain, your relationship to kind of the new atheist thinkers and kind of how that, I guess, became something you were interested in?
Well, I mean, I was like you talked about being raised by evangelicals. I wasn't raised by evangelicals, but I was close to that community through connections in my family. And there's not like, this is not the regular experience for the average Norwegian person. They have no idea that this exists. It's just like big bad Americans, stupid people. But I mean, from my perspective, I have a lot of respect and love for like the evangelical community and the let's say the red states, or the Bible Belt in the United States. I think they're like great people to be around. So I in a sense, to find a fancy in the new atheists, there was when I was introduced to that, when I came on YouTube early, I knew what I needed to know, in terms of the evangelical ideas. And the Kent Hovind was the guy that I was actually exposed to through these people, who I think he's in jail now, but like he was like one of these OG creationist thinkers, right? And so, like, through knowing these people, I get exposed to people like Kent Hovind, and I was very conflicted about it, because it goes very much against what I was taught in school and so on. And then you find like these new atheists who are just destroying all of this kind of stuff, and you just end up with having like this sort of contempt for these religious people, in a sense. But of course, this was something that I always just kind of struggled with. I was always very conflicted on how to think, whereas like, I really like these people, but they're just like wrong on every point. And I ended up just like not knowing really how to deal with that any further until recently. Like you could say my quote unquote radicalization journey into the dissident right was sort of just taking the pipeline after Trump lost, right? Just watching like mainstream conservative YouTubers cover the Trump election, and seeing that whole debacle unfold itself. I was very black-pilled after that. I was just thinking, what are we going to do about this as right, conservative people? There seems to be like no way to succeed politically at all. But through Sargon of Akkad, I found the Distributists, and through him I found Morgoth, and I found the Academic Agent through that, and that introduced me to a lot of different theory, and stuff like Moldbug, like the elite theory, like all of these thinkers that, and like Evola, these sort of pre-modern ways of thinking. And with that framework, I could sort of go back to the new atheists and take another look at, okay, what exactly was going on here? Like, just take all the tools that you have, take all these sort of critical thinking tools, everything that you've read about, and try to just look at what they're offering, not just as just like a truth proposition in terms of, is this religion true or false, or is this stuff in the Bible right or wrong, but also look at it as like new atheism, basically as a type of leftist political movement, which it was. I think that's the sort of correct way to analyze it, even though it's my conclusion was that it was ultimately not a very successful movement. It burned itself out very quickly and died because of infighting, but it was basically a sort of push to secularize society in a very aggressive way, and to push out a lot of these sort of pre-modern ideas through through a lot of the philosophy that comes from various participants in this new atheist movement, whether it would be in the sort of biology, like I talk about the selfish gene ideas, or whether it's like the Daniel Dennett materialist physicalist ideas and so on. So I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it answered it well. I've got a question. Did the kind of dichotomy of the new atheist worldview, essentially, that we're kind of, and this is kind of like movie Bob logic, where these kind of like backwards, like racist, inbred Ubermensch, who are simultaneously like so stupid they can't even understand, Darwin. They're all inbred, toothless hicks, who are also just like one step away from, essentially like uniting the U.S. under like, white Baptist Sharia, which obviously is like kind of like a dramatic oversimplification. You can kind of tell from how derisively I'm describing it. But did that kind of map onto like did that make sense, or was that exclusively an American import?
I mean, for me, I had to look at that through the lens of pragmatism, right? And that's where like Jordan Peterson thinking comes in, where you sort of separate, this kind of objective, hard truth from pragmatic truth. That I think like John Dewey is one of the main people behind that, where something is true if it works. And I kind of had to almost take this idea that okay, maybe like on an objective level, the fundamentalists are wrong, but from a pragmatic view, they're right. And like with the atheists, they seem to, okay, maybe they're objectively right, but they seem to be very difficult to actually build a worldview on top of their ideas, even though they might be objectively correct. But now I even doubt the fact that the atheist views are objectively correct. I think they're, objectively false. So at least a lot of the stuff that's been put out, like by Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and so on. I mean, I think it's just, it suffers from basically not only that it has a disrespect for religious ideas, but it seems to have a disrespect for a lot of science as well, and philosophy of science in general, philosophy and history.
No, I see what you mean. To me, the kind of two moments that I guess like individually took, because I think that obviously also coming through kind of like the Peterson pipeline, if you hadn't, like I had never directly interacted with Sam Harris, you kind of think he's smarter than he is because everyone says he's smart, if that makes sense. And then you hear what he has to say, and it's very clear that he is an absolute, like mouth breathing simpleton. And I only say that because he recently, had that interview that kind of blew up in his face, so to speak. But I'll never forget, this was relatively early. This was probably like 2016 or 2017. And it was kind of that mode of argument of, hey, here's something in the Bible that doesn't make sense, therefore Christians are wrong. And it's this passage where essentially they're talking about, the Israelites leaving Egypt. And it's this idea. It's like, oh, well, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, but that's only a 2-day or like a 7-day walk. Why are they wasting their time? Therefore, obviously they didn't spend 40 years walking, 50 miles or whatever. Therefore, the Bible is stupid and therefore it's wrong. Whereas here it's like, well, it's okay. Like, well, what's going on here? Is it literally like they got lost, like children get lost in the forest? Or was it like, wait a minute, they're trying to like wait for the old stock to die out, to get rid of the slave morality, and to me, it's like this, I don't know what to say. It is kind of like a kind of like classic, like leftist infiltration stuff, of like using essentially kind of like the flattery of, well, we'll make you smarter than your parents, like we'll kind of, we'll basically like convince you, that you've got the answers. You don't need to listen to them, use that kind of like attractive prospect to essentially get you to sign on to like the debunking, science, follow the science, I love my heckin' science mindset that kind of became weaponized just a few years later. Do you track with me?
Yeah, I track with you. And the thing that I realized, even if you look at it from, if you circle, it back to communism, let's say something like Mao's Cultural Revolution. I mean, that's sometimes put forward as a sort of an extreme example where they use children to basically propagandize their parents, right? that you send the children to the schools and they have to learn about communism, then they have to go home and propagandize their parents. But I do realize that the way that Western society, at least in these sort of more the industrialized transatlantic countries that have been a part of like what we call like the gay or the gay project, they've been very much using similar tactics in terms of trying to get rid of all of these what they consider like these more troublesome what maybe pre-modern or these kind of like traditional beliefs, in the sense that it's kind of using kids against their parents. And I think the new atheist movement worked that way. But another side to that, which the distributist talks about quite a bit, is the problem of brain drain, and not just like brain drain from a geopolitical, foreign relation perspective, but also brain drain in terms of urbanization within Western countries in the post-World War II era, where the urban planning idea was basically to give people, student loans so that people could move away from their local towns, and all of the smart talent could move into the big city and work basically as administrators or marketers that work in finance and so on. And this ended up having the effect of basically all of these, small towns where the smart people would have been preachers. They're just getting sucked out of that and put into the big city where they're going to work in finance instead. And so you still have the heartland of all of these evangelical families and the evangelical communities, but the smart people who would have been there previously have now been sucked out. And so it's very easy then to kind of reach their kids through media, whether it's television or the internet, and tell them about, oh, well, you think you could get all those animals on the ark, or, that would have been a 7-day walk or whatever, and ask their parents about that, and just have their parents be dumbfounded and not able to explain it, because like the people in that community who would have been able to give good intellectual answers are not there anymore. And that was sort of my experience as well.
It's interesting you bring that up, because I actually recently talked with that. One of my longstanding, friends and mentors, he's in my Telegram as George Bagby. We were talking about this, and he grew up in an extremely conservative Southern Baptist community. I can't remember what sect he was a part of, but they essentially held the fairly radical view that literally any Christian heresy ever was actually Baptists that had been repressed and kind of like conquered by the state. So any heresy whatsoever, the Gnostics, anything, was secret Baptists, and any kind of like writings of theirs that survived, those were obviously faked by, the Catholic Church, or whatever shadowy organization. So, quite an extreme religious group. He is, no longer a part of that. And what he was saying is that there's kind of a firm anti-intellectualism in kind of American conservative Christianity that's kind of understandable from a certain perspective, right? Because in America, kind of going back to, the Civil War, a little bit before, and especially through the progressive era, there was a giant divide between what we now call kind of like the mainline Protestant churches, and then the more conservative or the evangelical ones. Obviously both of those terms have loose meanings, but it's what we'll go with. And so when you have essentially, 150 years of kind of getting bullied by intellectuals, it kind of makes sense why you have this kind of like natural resistance to it. Like, oh, we don't want to write anything down. Oh, we don't have a seminary. Oh, we don't have some kind of tradition. It's all, lay preachers who are, in many cases intelligent, but they're not trained. There's no kind of like tradition outside of living memory. And so what happens is, okay, maybe that works for a little bit, and that might have been even the right decision at the time. But after a few generations pass, much like these small towns, you get essentially like a conservative or like a Christian brain drain, because these smart kids, who have, 110, 130, 140 IQs, they're not satisfied with kind of like what their parents are telling them. And they understandably, but incorrectly assume that there is no more intellectual version of it. So you hear Ron McIntyre talk about this, where he's like, look, like the entirety of, Reddit, kind of debunking atheism is predicated on essentially like tearing down the stories people tell to children. And fair enough, right? Like there are definitely simplified versions of the world that you have to tell to children, but to be fully fair, there are quite a few adults who have kind of willingly put themselves in that position of just kind of like, well, it is what it is. It's in the book. It's literally what it says. We don't have to think about it. And okay, fair enough. Just like telling a kid because I said so, that might win you one argument, but it's not a sustainable way to have a community, I guess, survive for decades.
Yeah, I agree. It's very interesting to hear about some of the roots of this the anti-intellectualism, as you say, because I mean it's wrong to just attribute it, as I did, to just one thing of the brain drain. Like there is a certain part of the communities themselves that have to take fault in how these things turn out. But I mean, there's been, not just with the developments in science, but the developments in technology and all of the infrastructure that have made it so easy to just move around, that I think, it flanked a lot of communities. I mean, it's not just, but this is a standard story, right? You have certain ideological religious communities that have certain beliefs, and they're just being flanked by technology. They just don't see it coming. They think they have it on lock, and then it just it completely sidelines them. I mean, I did, one of the Longhouse episodes, I talk about like technology and pornography, and I talk a little bit about like feminism and feminism in Scandinavia, that they were initially in like the 60s and 70s very successful in trying to shut down pornographers. Like they were shutting down stores that were peddling pornographic materials, and they were getting passed laws against prostitution and so on, and actually organizing, quite effectively. And then they sort of like, okay, we got this locked down, and then the internet just kind of creeps in the 90s, and suddenly everybody's watching pornography. And this is like this kind of, okay, now everybody's watching it, and it's just like this giant monolithic thing where they just have no answers for it. They just have no ways of actually approaching it. And even some of the younger feminists coming up are turning out to be like sex positive or whatever. So I mean, it's a bit of a different case, but there you can see that it's not just the Christians who had that problem of being outflanked by technology. It's happened to a lot of communities on the left as well. But let's see what we were going with. Yeah, the anti-intellectualism of the community. So.
Well, it's interesting you bring up pornography, because I feel like that's actually a particularly like useful one to look at, because you see this with kind of a lot of technologies, right? Where you have the kind of like the initial adoption, and there's either a benefit, maybe not in the case of pornography, but there seems to be no like readily observable harm. So if you talk to your boomer grandparents, I have boomer grandparents, right? And my grandfather would never say this, but I've heard people his age say this, right? And they'll say things like, "Oh, I don't know why kids these days, are so addicted to porn. Like when I was in Nam, or when I was in, Korea, we had Playboy and I turned out fine." And like, okay, fair enough. Obviously on a moral level, we can have some discussion, but, maybe looking at, Sears catalogs and titty mags, isn't going to cause the world to collapse. But the problem is, right, it's almost like there's no self-limiting to any sort of technology. If porn is really a technology, okay, maybe it is. But then it's kind of like, well, it kind of serves itself to a certain degree. And then 3 generations down the line, it's like, what, 45% of men, are essentially dealing with erectile dysfunction. And it's like, well, okay, maybe there was some kind of problem there that, you couldn't see initially. And to me, I think you see the same thing with kind of mass public transit. We're like, all right, like trains are pretty useful, but all of a sudden, like, and there's a lot of, like kind of 19th century, like British writers talking about this, where they're basically like, well, wait a minute, like the village structure has been destroyed, because you don't need everything to kind of exist on the village level. And like cars had an exponential effect, right? So, and I don't mean to come off like a religious nutcase, but, it's kind of what comes to hand. You see the same thing happen with churches, right? So traditionally, churches were kind of organized on like a parish model, where everyone in your neighborhood, if they went to church, went to the same church, because realistically, you kind of had to, like maybe you had a horse and buggy, but even then, that's not exactly, like fast transportation. But now everyone has a car, and it becomes viable for you to essentially like choose, the kind of church you want. It kind of creates like this preference cascade. And what I think you find out very quickly is that when people have choices, they won't make the choices that are good for them. They'll make kind of like the easy choice. Like you'll satisfy your lizard brain.
Yes, I mean, especially now with the way society is structured and the modern interpretation of liberalism within like this humanist framework. That is, as you said, if you can't observe any readily harm, there's nothing wrong with it, right? And there's nobody in power who's willing or interested in doing, making some hard decisions in terms of saying that maybe we're not going to do this, or maybe we're going to wait with releasing this stuff. They just think, the line goes up and everybody's happy. I mean, of course, we could trace that back to the economic thinking, and that makes it sound like it's kind of emergent. But I also think it's very much, if we circle it back to elite theory, very much a part of like the post World War II regime. If you think about, if elite theory says that organization is better than non-organization, and small groups who organize are better than, it's easier to organize smaller groups than bigger groups. And of course, if you are organized and you have taken power, what do you have to do to keep power? Well, you have to keep other people from organizing. And in many ways, I think like the kind of post World War II liberalism is like the perfect way to just stop anybody from organizing against the regime, and not just from. I mean, the like you said, the anti-intellectualism could be a part of that. But if you just have a bunch of self-interested individuals who are making choices based on a sort of pleasure principle, in a sense, there's very little potential for organization there. It's just all kind of whatever feels good right now, I'm just going to do. And if you tell me that I can't do something that feels good, then well, screw you, basically. I have the rights that are protect my pleasure principle, and you don't have rights to force me to do anything.
Well, and it's
So
actually carry on. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Sorry, you can talk.
So it's actually that exact mechanism you're talking about is why I have kind of such disdain for kind of like barstool conservatives and libertarians, right? Where it's this bizarre idea that, well, we'll be the ones who can stop the boulder halfway down the hill. If we can just, essentially like dig our feet in extra hard, we can kind of freeze entropy at a certain point. And so to me, it's kind of like I see there as being like two realistic ways to look at this, which is either, we lean in, you really do become the bug, become the pod person, like essentially like fine, lean full in, become a Amazon drone by day, a VTuber by night, do whatever, essentially full hedonism. Or you kind of have to look around and you're like, well, okay, like the William F. Buckley route isn't working. We're not going to essentially manage the decline. And to me, that's kind of where the interesting conversation is happening. And it's happening in our circles in a variety of different directions. It's kind of like, well, okay, like if 90s liberalism or liberalism in general, or okay, let's just say post-Enlightenment thought, depending on how radical we want to get, is off the table, well, what comes next? And to me, that's what I think the most interesting parts about our circles is whatever verb agrees with that. Yes. Is that we're kind of actually asking a question that hasn't been asked, at least on the internet, at some kind of scale. And I think that's quite entertaining, regardless of the fact that I don't have my own, like personal theory on how we get out of this.
No, I mean, this is also what interests me about this community, because it implies a certain kind of seriousness. Just looking back at the 50, 60 years of the Buckley conservative, or the Edmund Burke conservatism, as some people refer to it. I mean, that it's basically conserved nothing. It's conceded to the progressives on every point. Like, I mean, and it's almost just kind of laughable to look back at some of these conservative, conservative YouTubers, these conservative politicians at this point. If you know a little bit of history, like we do, and you know a little bit of political theory, I mean, you see that they're basically just there to sort of play the heel or something, or just to make the spreadsheet look good, because they have absolutely no power at all to stop anything that's happening. They've conceded. I mean, they basically conceded the structure of reality, in my view, to the left. I mean, if you basically allow the left to define, what racism is, you allow the left to define what marriage is, what a man is, and what a woman is, and basically the entire structure that we operate in is within the hegemony of the progressives. And if you've conceded that, I mean, you can't really concede anything else. They have basically lost. I see it as a sort of completely defunct movement. So the exciting conversation, as you say, is really, okay, what comes next? How do we find something that we can dig our heels into that could actually reverse the problem? And I do think it's actually very much reversible. There's really, I don't try to lock myself too much into thinking in terms of like cyclical history, as I think is popular with some people in the DR, to the point where, I am a little bit more of this kind of I think that gradual vision might actually be possible, even though it's a little bit against the odds in terms of what's being tried to do here. But there is really, unless you have to subscribe to some very complicated metaphysical theory, no reason why you can't just like turn back or remove the laws and just kind of break down some of these elite coalitions, basically, and some of the ideological frameworks that unite the current elites, if you see what I mean.
No, I do, because and you've said multiple times, kind of like this idea of buying into the frame of your enemy. And in many ways, and you hear this, people are like, oh, you can't go back. You can't go back. And to a certain extent, they're right. Like you can't really have Charlemagne II, and he'll be just like the old one, but he'll be new, and so we'll call him Charlemagne II. Like that doesn't work. That's stupid. But I also don't really see anyone suggesting that, short of kind of like people who are so unserious we don't have to deal with them. So there is, but if we do kind of believe, right, that there is this kind of like, I guess, like true nature to reality, right? There is, to a certain extent, like things eventually will, reorient, and it's quite likely that if structures existed for a while, right, if they were Lindy, that they will kind of return to something similar. And so to a certain extent, the idea that you can't go back is true, right? In the most literal, on the nose sense, you can't go back. But I think that you're quite right that, like, okay, well, if you can't go back and we can't continue on, well, what do you do? And so I think that Charles Haywood, who I quite like, he's generally connected to these circles, has been talking a lot about this. We're basically like, okay, like, well, what comes next, and like, how do we essentially use the wisdom of the past to forge something new? And so to me, I don't know. I obviously, like, I recognize there's some kind of tension there, but I am fascinated by the question, if nothing else.
Yes, I mean, the way that I think about it, of course, we can't go back, and I think there's, that's a bit of baggage that people in the DR carry, that they really want to kind of relive the authentic experience of people who lived 100 or 200 years in the past, and of course, that's not happening. We are where we are, and it's going to have the amount of like kind of fakeness and hyper reality, but there's no reason why we can't break apart these elite coalitions that currently you basically run the show. That's my view, is that they've broken apart our, if you look at like the post World War, whether it's like the Thomas 770 sort of anti-fascist regime or the Boomer Truth or whatever, like this is basically a lot of these current elites breaking apart the previous elites or the previous powers, in a sense. So there's no reason why we can't do that to them, or find some creative way to just kind of break apart the ideological frameworks that keep them together, in a sense. I mean, this is one of the streams, I don't know if you watched that one, where I do a sort of history of the Norwegian LGBTQ movement, or the sort of LGBTQ movements in Scandinavia. And I mean, a reason why they ended up becoming so powerful is that they were basically allowed to organize, right? And this was sort of made very easy for them when they were able to remove laws that, say like sodomy laws that were on the books that said that you basically, like, sex between men is not legal. So if you have an organization then that promotes that, then like you're basically breaking the law on multiple levels, right? And so it's impossible to actually organize formally if you have laws like that on the books. But them just removing that stuff and putting in laws that stop people like us from organizing, there's no reason why we can't just like reverse that at some point and just say that, like, no, okay, we're just taking that out, right? We're just and that's what I sort of see as, I'm making it sound like super simple, but that's what I kind of see as like what needs to happen, is that basically the laws that are on the books currently stopping people like us from organizing, and that are making it so easy for like the progressives to organize, need to just be shuffled around. And the culture, the let's say all of these, all of the movies, all this kind of stuff that kind of reinforces the progressive worldview. It just needs to be, if not removed, it just needs, you have to have something else that just replaces it, and from there they can grow something.
I couldn't agree more. And I also think that if we look at kind of the analogy earlier of kind of COVID being a 9/11 type event, like a watershed, one of the things that I think that we have to take away from it, and I think that people like Pete Quinones, who I've had on before, and is a big influence of mine, what he kind of came to this realization that look, the old way of looking at things doesn't work anymore. This idea of oh, we can't use state power because that's what our enemies would do. And this is not a comment on Tolkien, but I've been reading his, I've been reading Lord of the Rings and just finished today. And the idea that oh, well, you can destroy power, you can cast power into Mount Doom. And when we're in charge, we won't use kind of the coercive force of the state on our enemies because we wouldn't want to set a bad precedent. And I think that after 2020, that the consensus needs to be, it doesn't matter what we do. They don't care about precedent. And if we don't essentially seize the reins, if we don't hit back, it's not just going to be, oh, we never win an election and, my taxes are higher than they'd like to be. It's well, they will literally make it illegal for you to have a job. They will essentially castrate your children. They will do bad things to you, and they will essentially revel while doing it. And so I think that the idea that much like the kind of straw man of Buckleyite conservatism that, you and I have been just beating up all episode, the idea that, oh, we just need to play the game by the rules extra hard is laughable and needs to be just completely discarded. There's nothing left there.
Yeah, I completely agree. Maybe a little bit, as academic agent says, to sort of de-boomerize yourself of a lot of these ideas and try to think of it in terms of, if you have a certain idea in your head, say the neutral institution, you have to realize that the reason you believe that is because the elites don't want you to organize. They're if you think that, okay, we can't use this institution, or we can't use this lever of power or this angle or this vector of attack against the powers that be. I mean, you believe that because they want you to believe that. They don't want competitors, and they've made damn sure that you're supposed to think that this is off limits for you to use, but it's not off limits for them. So I mean, there's just nothing intrinsic that says that you can't use institutions to further political goals, but you've kind of been spoon-fed this idea from in schools and through osmosis in the culture and so on. But it's I mean, it's total bunk. There's really no reason why you shouldn't.
Well, and it's so much, I guess, the hidden poison pill that the new atheists smuggled in, right? It's oh, well, there's just science, neutral science. And if you want to be a rebel, fighting the power, what you need to do is align yourself with counter jihad, so the military industrial complex, science, so the pharma industrial complex, and the biggest enemy to you, well, it just happens that's the regime's enemies too. So it's very much this kind of to go back to kind of what you said earlier, this Kaczynskiite idea of essentially manufactured rebellion. It's the system's greatest trick, right? That essentially the motif of rebellion kind of wraps you back around into the system. And once it's out of date, once it's kind of past its sell by date, I think Sam Harris very clearly is, it's very clear, that how those people have been played.
I think it's perfectly put. I mean, in terms of the idea that you just have to follow the science. I mean, science is also not off limits, and it has never ever been off limits to politics ever. And that's something that, I mean, if you look at the history of science, you'll see that. I mean, look at the philosophy of science and so on. But going back to the LGBTQ episode, I mean, the way that these the LGBTQ lobby were able to, at least in the Scandinavian countries, remove the sodomy laws was by convincing legislators that the science says that homosexuality is not a choice, it's a disease, right? So science says that. We got fresh new science from Amsterdam that says that homosexuality is a born disease. And if science says that it's a born disease, then you can't have legislation on the book that says that it's a sin, because it can't be a sin if you can't choose. And the people who were peddling this science and who were creating this science, and they didn't believe that. They knew that this was a tool that they could use to just kind of break the barrier, basically to break the dam, so that they could get in and do real damage. So they've kind of understood this for a long time, that science is not neutral. It's not neutral in any way. And that was one of my points as well, like with the selfish gene episode, that, you know, you should really take a hard look at, you know, what kind of science you want to use for your political ends, and what you don't want to use, and kind of the problems relating to that. And of course, I mean, if I'd heard somebody say that, say like 5-10 years ago, that would be just like complete sacrilege. Like, it's just like this postmodern insanity. But again, I don't see any reason not to. You should just be able to kind of just like pick and choose the science that's going to fit the political goals that you have, in a sense, unless you're completely at odds with reality. And with a lot of this stuff, especially with social science and sociology, psychology, and stuff, that like the objectivity factor is really not there. You know, you're not dealing with electrical grids or dams or bridges or anything like that. You are just like creating models of how the human mind works, or how people, you know, work socially. And I mean, it's a massively complex thing. And you might never actually reach the core of what that is. So then there's really no reason why you shouldn't just use science to further your political goals. I mean, everybody's doing that. Like with the Harari stream, you know, the World Economic Forum people are doing that. They're basically saying that, you know, well, science says that the human being is hackable, like the human being is just an algorithm, and we can hack the human being the same way we hack computers and make them fit into our, you know, new kind of environmentally friendly digital utopia that's sustainable, and, you know, that happy kind of, what do you call it, the 5 feet city, or all of these kind of, you know, monstrous ideas that they have. So there's no reason why we should look at science and say that has to just, you know, be maintained as an objective institution, because it never was.
Well, and I think that you're right to draw a distinction between, because obviously if you know, hypothetically, the, you know, Red Caesar comes and installs some kind of like, you know, based hyper trad pilled, you know, reactionary super state or whatever, I'm assured is just around the corner every 10 minutes, right? Like it would be a bad society if there was a regime approved way to build a bridge. You know, like there was an ideological bridge. Like, okay, we see that go poorly. You know, so to a certain extent, right? Like the laws of the material universe don't care about what you think, right? Like reality exists. You kind of conform yourself to it. But I think you're right to kind of like draw attention to that social science and how much of it really is like, hey, I built a formula, it spat out a number, now give me $5 billion. You know, where it is this very much like kind of like naked like process of essentially on one hand propping up the regime by lending it an air of legitimacy, and on the other end essentially serving as a patronage network to essentially dole out money to your followers, you know, much like anything else. So in a sense, right, like obviously like you don't want politics in science to a certain extent, but there's another level where it's like looking at science as somehow kind of like separated from human nature is a distinctly ideological proposition, and I think that one that we really need to disabuse ourselves of.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I mean, with you saying that, it brings to attention something that I've been thinking a lot about lately, and it's sort of what I consider. I mean, you know, I did the stream on the selfish gene where I was talking about, you know, evolution as being kind of a speed bump with the dissident right worldview and how to approach evolutionary theory and so on. But there's another thing that I've been thinking a lot about lately. That's really what I call like the first world, third world problem. That I mean, we can try to create visions for the future, but there's a lot of stuff within like the dissident right sphere, within a lot of these different factions, and the theory that they adhere to, that leads itself very much to a sort of third world way of thinking, and a sort of very third world approach. And that's something that I really think we should try to avoid. The problem is just how that should be done. I don't know if you've had any similar thoughts on that. You were talking about institutions, is that you want, you know, institutions to actually do what the institution does. Like you want a science laboratory to produce actual, you know, science, or you want some let's say an organization that collects data on knee injuries. You want them to actually collect data on knee injuries and not promote trans kids or something, right? But there is this sort of temptation, you know, especially with, like, say the popularization of Carl Schmitt and the sort of friend-enemy distinction, for example. This is just one example among many, where you basically say something like, well, you know, politics is about, you know, rewarding friends and punishing the enemies. But that's just like two steps away from saying corruption is based, right? and that's the sort of problem with the kind of third worldism, is that it very, quickly, if we are able to gain power, that would just lead to a kind of third world where people are just creating a sort of kleptocracy or some type of system that is becomes a lot less functional than the one we have, because it's the theory kind of points in that direction. I don't know if you agree with that, or if you've thought about something similar.
No, I actively have, and it's one of those, like, it seems to me at least, intractable problems, because on one hand it's like there is an amount of meritocracy you need to function, right? And maybe it's not the amount we currently have, meritocracy in quotes. Maybe it's not kind of like what propelled us to this height, but I know what you mean, right? On one hand, it's like if our vision for society is essentially just, well, giving our friends and relatives high paying important jobs, like that is both corrupting in like a moral sense, right? Like that's a bad way to run a society, but it's also going to give you bad results. And so maybe the answer is like, okay, well, it gives you bad results in the short term, but everything kind of stabilizes out over time. Maybe. But to me, like, if you look at the kind of like, and this is, I think, to me, the really like galling and disappointing thing about how much social capital has been burned up by our absolutely godforsaken elites, is that in order to have these kind of effective institutions, you need a high trust society, right? Like you need a society in which like the kind of like softer things, that you can't really put down on a spreadsheet are kind of maintained, and I think that kind of high trust society is essential to having institutions that actually put out work. And when you see places like Eastern Europe, like a lot of the third world, that have extremely low trust societies, not only is it non-functional in the institutional sense, but also on an interpersonal level. And to me, I don't know how we get back to a high trust society without essentially like going through the crucible. And I don't want that to be true. Like I want essentially to go through like a minimal amount of discomfort and then have everything work out fine. But I know what you mean, that like I don't think that Lamau based corruption actually really is the way to get out of this. Like, okay, fair enough. Maybe for like federal bureaucrats, that's a good idea, because let's be honest, they're kind of social leeches anyway. But when it comes to things that are kind of like in that in-between level, like as has become very apparent over the last 3 years, the NIH, like I don't know how we, I don't know how we get around that.
Well, I mean, I've been trying to look at certain cases of success stories, because, as you said, if you go with this kind of like either this BAP or this sort of Andrew Tate view of the world, there's a lot of based countries, in terms of the friend-enemy distinction. Whether you look at like Latin America or Eastern Europe and so on, where it's like, oh yeah, it's totally based politicians that just take money right from the people, the Nietzschean Übermensches. No, but actually, one country I did look at is Singapore, where they have actually been able to take a sort of third world slum and turn it into a first world country within a span of 50 years, with the sort of politician Lee Kuan Yew from the People's Action Party, that basically just sort of installed himself as a kind of dictator and forced the people to sort of work with like very kind of free market policies and really like very strict authoritarian rules in terms of corruption and so on, where he basically had like death penalty for corruption within politics and certain institutions. I mean, that sounds ridiculous, but it actually worked for him, right? So, and this was also a case like that it goes on a quarter. It really just break with a lot of the ideas within the dissident right, because you have, let's say, like the nationalist faction of the dissident right, who are very much on this stuff with preserving authentic culture. They want to preserve, let's say, authentic British culture, authentic Christianity. I mean, you get some of the people supporting Ukraine for that reason, right? Because they think that the Ukrainians should be able to break off and be sovereign and have their authentic Ukrainian culture and so on. But I mean, to me, this is completely counterproductive if you're actually wanting to build an ordered society. Because let's say you take Singapore again. I mean, the Singaporean population is quite mixed. You have some Christians, some Buddhist, and some Taoist, and secular people and so on. And I mean, that's just been kind of it's not been encouraged. It's been very authoritarian in terms of shutting that stuff down if that gets in the way of trying to progress order and building the society up. Whereas I see with like a lot of the people in the DR, they seem to be more in this kind of 90s preserving culture, almost like this kind of 90s leftism, where they have this kind of globe-trotting, every culture is valuable type of idea, where there's I just want nationalism for all peoples, right? But that essentially just means, kind of in my view, just more third worldism. It just means more conflict. And I don't know if you have an opinion on that.
No, I do. Because on one hand, like I kind of find myself in agreement with that kind of like nationalism for everyone sentiment. Like I want to live in a world in which Norway feels like Norway, and I kind of very much mourn the loss of kind of like regional dialects and regional differences, the kind of things that actually make like human beings interesting. But you do kind of have to like, I guess, like measure that against kind of like the way the world actually works, And so to me, it's like, and it's actually why I'm not such a big fan of nationalism per se. It's nothing to do with, like nationalists as people. But to me, it is very much like it is an ideology. It's like a secret magical plan to save the world. And any one of those, this kind of like self-contained system, I think is just like pure toxic and pure poison. And so when it comes to small countries, I think that nationalism is stupid. Like again, this is a delicate topic, but I should slay Slava Ukraini. I fully support Ukraine, all of that. But hypothetically, right? Like it's not a smart decision. Like really, like if you've got the hypothetical like grizzly bear next door, like puffing up your chest, knocking on his door and challenging him to a fist fight, stupid. And so I'm not trying to avoid you here. It's just that these are problems I see and I don't know what the answer is. Like look, I'm 23, I'm reading as fast as I can, but I'm not exactly well read on these topics, but I know and I recognize that kind of like tension you're pointing at.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not. There's no like one right answer necessarily, but I mean, the problem that I'm seeing here is that on the one hand, you have the idea of order, right? That the right wing is supposed to represent order in the dissident rights, and order in some sense would mean living in a first world nation that has a high degree of investment and that has institutions that function, that aren't corrupt and so on. But then that ends up then competing with the idea that everybody should be a nationalist and everybody should be a regionalist or try to secede from each other and so on. I don't see how that creates more order in a sense. A lot of the same way with the little bit of that Bronze Age perverts ideas of the sort of piratical piratical band of men who will just come in and take over. I mean, if there's no kind of morality that's tied into that, then you kind of just end up with another kleptocracy in a sense. And I think we have enough of those already.
That's fair. One thing I would say is that kind of like looking at the tradition of subsidiarity, right? Where like there is order. There's a very definite hierarchy, right? Like the king has essentially like barons have a level of fealty to the king, so on and so forth. And authority to a certain extent is devolved, right? Like, okay, if you have a crime done against you, you don't go to the king, you go to your baron who, has a court system. And so to a certain extent, maybe that is chaotic, right? Like there are different rules everywhere, but also there is a great deal of order, like on the ground, right? Like AA has actually done a decent amount of work essentially talking about kind of like crime under the medieval system. And so I think that the idea of like kind of like unification as order, the idea of like there's one person in charge over the whole thing is a relatively modern one, right? Like the idea of the nation state is not an eternal one. And so when I said that nationalism was an ideology, that's kind of what I meant. That it kind of has that smuggled premise of the nation state being the building block, which is not kind of a universal one throughout human history, right? Like even look at the Roman Empire, which was, I'm no scholar, right? Which is to a certain extent incredibly authoritarian, right? Like it was a military dictatorship to a certain degree, right? But also like within that, just by virtue of the fact of being a large thing, you couldn't micromanage everything. And I think that it's obviously, like, there are things that will fall through the cracks, but I don't necessarily see those as being like in opposition to one another. The idea of like localism and order. And I think one of the other things, and look, like, I don't watch or I don't consume a lot of BAP stuff. Like, he's not to my personal taste, so I don't know him well. But to me, the kind of like Conan the Barbarian Ubermensch stuff, like, I don't know how reflective of objective reality that is, right? Like, to me, that seems to a certain extent to be kind of much like nationalism, like based on some ideological premises that are not necessarily directly addressed.
Yeah, I do think you have a lot of historical support for his position. With you basically look at the development of Indo-Europe with the pastoral peoples, and really like how civilizations are formed with caste systems, where you have a sort of aristocracy that ends up dominating the lower classes in a sort of sense. But that only becomes good if like the warlord becomes a king, right? And he actually sort of embraces his underlings and tries to care for them. But if you just sort of stay at this kind of piratical, this kind of Andrew Tate mode, in a sense, like you're just going to have a type of kleptocracy that's going to be uncomfortable for everybody involved. So
I quite agree, and I'm also I guess I'm just, and this may be a different question. I'm not to get too like esoteric and out there. I'm not sure how long you could really stay in that state. It seems to me like there is kind of like a logical progression or like an arms race, right? And if you have the kind of the warlord versus the king, I'm not sure the warlord wins that. Like, okay, fair enough. Maybe in the sense of, like the Huns obviously killed about everyone. But realistically, right, like the places that they conquered didn't kind of like become, I don't know how to describe this. I'm kind of floundering for words here, but they kind of stayed, obviously not to a certain degree genetically, but like the places that these like marauding bands overran stayed the places they were. Obviously things were destroyed, people were destroyed, but I don't know if that kind of like roving piratical band actually has any kind of like sticking power as a civilization. I think that's a very transitory stage. And even people like the Frankish kings, right? Like they kind of showed up as these essentially like unwashed barbarians. Like I'm not super familiar with the history, but I know enough about it to know that, right? But very quickly that kind of transforms into the role of king. So I guess that's why I've been kind of dissatisfied with the kind of like the Andrew Tate morality.
yeah, no, I think we completely agree on that, and I don't want to drag myself out on deep waters either. I'm not super familiar with a lot of this history, and I also don't want to try to slam BAP or anything. Like I find his podcast very entertaining and informative as well. It's just sort of a part of my project. There are things that I'm thinking about currently. It's like how you look at these different strains of ideas that exist within the DR, and how I feel like a lot of them just naturally end up leading to more of like a less ordered society, basically, if you actually were able to implement them contra a more ordered society. Where, of course, that's where you get the negative vision of just clearing them out. But there has to be, eventually there has to be a positive vision. Like there has to be something else than just trying to remove elites.
No, that's well said. And I think that, as we've kind of been saying, is the question of the hour. I certainly don't know what the answer is, but I hope it comes soon. So anyway, man, thank you so much for coming out. We're about at time. So is there anything you'd like to plug before we wrap things up?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So yeah, people should just check out the Longhouse. Basically, it's on A Walrus's channel, where I appear as a co-host and a panelist. So we stream every Thursday, and there's going to be other content that's coming out as well. We got a clips channel that you can go and check out if you don't want to watch like the entire 3-hour streams. And of course, if you want to laugh, you can check out my channel. That's just Luddic Path for right-wing memes. So yeah, I guess that's it.
All right. So I'll get my plugs out of the way relatively quickly. Tomorrow night, I will be on Unpopular Opinion Academic Agents channel. So come out to see what we're talking about. As of the current date, I actually don't know what I'll be talking about, but hopefully I won't make a fool of myself. This is also the first episode to be headed straight to audio-only podcatchers. So this episode is available on Spotify, Apple, anywhere you normally listen to podcasts, as well as YouTube. My links are down in the description, as are Luddic Paths. And remember, guys, keep your head up. Light can't last forever. Good night, everyone.